On this Epiphany Sunday this morning, we read the story of the three wise men. Our New Testament reading is Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. The word of the Lord. So, we just finished out December, which officially brought to close my 4th month as pastor here. I can tell in my brain that in some ways I'm still working on that academic calendar. You start at the beginning of September and you work through the fall. And, we had our Christmas Eve services, and I guess that kind of felt like a final exam a little bit, And now I think I'm subconsciously kind of waiting to receive a letter grade for my performance, I'm not looking for one, I'm just saying. I think my brain is waiting for it, When I was in high school and college, I was always trying to be an A student, the ambitious type. But it's kind of funny because when you get to law school, which I did after college, all of a sudden you're competing against everyone that is also A students. At UVA, we were graded on a curve. It was a B+ curve. So if you got a B+, you were kind of keeping up with everybody else. So for most of us, B+ was the goal. So ever since law school, I think in my mind, I'm always thinking, could I give myself a solid B+ for that? I took a look, and I've preached about 15 sermons so far here in Jefferson. And as I've done those, I've tried to make my goals with these sermons pretty clear as we've gone along. Reflecting on where we're at in our spiritual lives, where we're trying to go as a church, building a spiritual foundation upon which we can build and go in new directions. In the midst of that, there have been plenty of events that have occurred in the world at large that I think could have warranted a look from the pulpit. But again, with my focus on those other things, I've let most of them pass on by until today. This past week, something did happen that grabbed me pretty powerfully, and I think it probably did for some of you too. And when it did, God told me very clearly not to simply let this one pass on by. And so I won't. Last Sunday, an absolute tragedy occurred at West Freeway Church of Christ in White Settlement, Texas. During Sunday worship there, an armed man entered the sanctuary. This man had received financial support from the church in the past, and church staff have since suggested that He was perhaps upset that they had not given him more support or ongoing support, although we don't know for a fact that was his motivation. Regardless, this man entered the sanctuary with the intent to kill people in that church. So he opened fire and killed 2 members of the congregation before one of the members of the congregation stood up, took out his own gun, and with one shot, killed the shooter. Obviously, this event has left that church reeling, and they are currently trying to pick up the pieces and find a path forward from this tragedy. But I think probably, this event hits home with each and every one of us that simply goes to church every Sunday. In fact, just me bringing up this story while we're all here in church might be a little uncomfortable for some of us. But I truly believe that as tragic as this event was, with families torn apart by the loss of loved ones and the trauma those people will now endure, God is speaking to us amidst this tragedy. Even as the media puts its spin on it and politicians use it for their purposes, God's still small voice is speaking in the midst of that. We, as the Church Universal, have something to take away from this as we ourselves carry on and open our doors to the world every week. Now, for starters, it's not my goal to tell you how to think on this issue. I'm not looking to sway how you feel about security in the church or guns in church or anything like that. In fact, I'm not even looking to share my opinion with you on those things. No, my goal is simply to look at the meaning of it. What does it mean that we open our doors every week? What does it mean to serve others whom we may not really know? What does it mean to be a target, which churches clearly sometimes are? Well, it means we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable. We're vulnerable because when you serve someone, you're inherently making yourself vulnerable. When you're bowing your head, when you're washing someone's feet, that's a vulnerable position. And it's exactly where Christ has called us. It's exactly where Christ served himself. Now again, I'm not trying to make a statement here about how we approach church security. But what I think it's important to realize is that to truly be a community of open arms, a community that welcomes the least of these among us, we will always invite some amount of vulnerability. Now, I suppose a church could put, armed guards at the front and a metal detector at the door, and you're probably going to stifle most major threats that would come your way, But I think we all know in our hearts that this isn't the kind of openness that Christ is calling us to. It's kind of hard to welcome someone when you're simultaneously patting them down for firearms. Just saying. So it seems to me that this vulnerability, it's a reality of being an open community. And of course, with that vulnerability, there's another issue. Jesus told us in very clear words that Christians will always be maligned by the world. He said, "You will be hated by everyone because of me. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved." So to follow Jesus, it seems, we must not only submit to one another and make ourselves vulnerable, but we must also carry a very real target on our backs, to be hated. It would seem then that choosing to follow Christ means choosing to follow a path that is at least pretty far from the safest path that we could take. Now, you may be wondering how our New Testament passage fits in today, the Epiphany, the 3 wise men. And I admit I wondered that at first too, until I stopped and realized how much danger these men took upon themselves to seek Jesus. Now, we really have no idea exactly who the three wise men were, other than that they came from the east. They're often described as kings because there are Old Testament allusions to kings coming to worship the Messiah, like in our Isaiah reading today. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. I think the king's description here works with what God is talking to us about this morning. These men traveled hundreds of miles, leaving the safety of their home. Now, in those days, when you took a long trip, you were not necessarily confident you were coming home. Robbers, poor sanitation, questionable food along the way. It goes without saying they weren't staying at Holiday Inns on this journey. No, their accommodations likely paled in comparison to the confines of kings, or even priests, if maybe that's what they were. And all for what, exactly? To see a baby in a manger, to fall down before him, declare him Lord. Was it worth it? To take on that risk just to see a baby? Could it be worth it? To fall on your knees before Jesus, to bow our heads and say, I love you, Lord. There's risk there. We all took that risk upon ourselves this morning when we came here to this building. But even as we all reflect on what happened in Texas, maybe ponder if we're prepared to handle such a situation here, or even wonder what would have happened if it had happened here. You know, it's hard not to think about that. I think there's one other thing we need to keep in mind. We know the cost of discipleship is real. The cost of discipleship, it's high. When we open our doors and invite all comers, there is a cost there. To invite any and all without knowing them, there's a cost, and it's an offering to God. We are sacrificing something. We are sacrificing an element of our own safety when we do that. We might be more comfortable keeping certain individuals away from this church. But there's a lot more to the cost of discipleship than just opening our doors and keeping them open. We all know that every time we really open our hearts to God and say, your will be done, not mine, well, we've taken on as big a risk as you could take. Who knows where that's going to take you? God, you be in control, not me. That kind of mindset could take you anywhere. That kind of trust, to truly submit to the will of God, well, that's scarier than anything that's going to walk through our doors. We know that if we follow Christ, if we really follow Christ, we're going to encounter hardships. There will be threats to our body and soul. It's part of the job. The disciples did, the apostles did, Jesus very clearly did. And we as a church will continue making decisions on how to best account for those risks as we still do our ministry. After all, the shepherds are entrusted with the task of protecting the flock, and when you see a storm on the horizon, there's no reason to ignore it. But the question that's being begged here, I think, that still small voice of God is more like shouting for me right now, is are we willing to follow Christ if it means that we will never be completely safe? Is it worth it? Now, we know that just living in this world is a dangerous thing. We all know that safety, this idea that we can't be harmed, it's always an illusion, or at least it's always relative. So I guess the question is, would we rather chase that illusion of safety or chase after God? Will we open our arms wide? And I mean wide. Even if it means those arms might get scratched and bruised. Well, whatever you decide after reflecting on this, I invite you to hear the words of the gospel. Matthew 10:28. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. That's a hard lesson, my friends. It is. It's easier said than done, too. But I think it still points us in the right direction. The safety of the soul is a bigger concern than the safety of the body, because the soul is eternal. It's a tough lesson. So one more time, I hope I didn't stifle conversations on security in our church. I do think we should have those conversations openly as things like this come up, as events like this occur. How we might be more prepared for a situation like this. But I hope you're willing to pause that conversation just for a moment with me, right here in the words of Matthew. If Jesus is right, and we know he is, if the safety of the soul matters more than the safety of the body, then my friends, when you walk through those doors and settle into your spot in the pew that you've claimed for the last 20 years, I hope the question of whether you're physically safe here isn't the first thing on your mind, because we have an even more important question to answer. Do we feel safe with God? Do we feel safe knowing that our eternal home is with God, that our souls are in his very hands? That with God, not just our bodies, but our souls are truly vulnerable, or truly laid bare, that our sins are laid out before him. Do we feel safe in that way? Or is that an even harder task? Do we wonder if God really will forgive us for what we've done? Is God's love truly unconditional? To be truly vulnerable with God, I think we're all still working on that one in our own way. But be assured of this. When that day comes that we are truly, fully at peace in God's arms, fully trusting, it won't matter who comes through those doors or what comes through those doors, because we'll already be home. Amen.